Hi everyone, welcome to another class lecture, and for this time let's discuss about morality of human acts. So what is this all about? So from the very definition of human acts, actus humani, this refer to the actions that proceed from insight into the nature and purpose of one's doing and from consent of the free will. Specifically, such human acts are those actions done by a person in certain situations which are essentially the result of his and her conscious knowledge, freedom, and voluntariness or consent. Hence, these actions are performed by men knowingly, freely, and voluntarily. So that is the very definition of human acts. According to Monsignor Paul Glenn, human acts is an act which proceeds from the deliberate free will of men. It is also classified as good or bad, right or wrong, and thus it should be subjected to morality and its norms. Okay? Human acts, as what I said, involves the knowledge, freedom, and voluntariness or consent on the part of the acting agent. So human acts are the free and the conscious acts of a human person which are proper to humans alone. These actions are what make a human being truly human, an earthly creature different and distinct from all other creatures. So all human acts are an acts of man, but not all acts of a man are human acts. So what does it mean? So most textbook in Christian ethics and morality dealing with the subject, it usually distinguish between human acts and acts of men. There are difference from this too. While human acts, as what I mentioned, it proceed from one's conscious knowledge as well as freedom and voluntariness. The same cannot be said for acts of men. So the latter are simply the actions which happen in the person naturally. Okay, naturally, even without his or her awareness of himself or herself. While doing them, these actions are done without deliberation, reflection, and consent. They are performed just instinctively. Okay? So, it can rightful to say that all human acts are acts of men, but not all acts of men are human acts. I will give you an example. Acts of men are the various physiological processes, such as the beating of the heart, breathing, respiration, digestion, and others. Other example includes actions that are spontaneously happening in the person during his or her impulsive, unconscious, and instinctive moments, such as instant and spontaneous feelings of fear, rage, and anger, sleeping, dreaming, seeing, eating, and walking, and among others. The acts of men, therefore, are those that humans share with animals whose actions and movements emanate from purely sensual nature. These things are performed without deliberation and free will. The person here is neither morally responsible nor accountable for these kinds of actions. Okay? So this is the definition of the statement. All human acts are acts of men, but not all acts of men are human acts. I hope it made clear for you. Let's go to the basic elements of human acts. According to the book of Ramon Agapay, which is entitled Ethics and the Filipino, a Manual of Moral for Students and Educators, it lists down and briefly expounds the following characteristics for an act to be considered a human act. Number one, the act must be deliberate. It must be performed by a conscious agent who is very much aware of what he or she is doing and its consequences, good or evil. So children who are below the age of reason, the insane, the senile, lunatics, people who are under the heavy influence of drugs and alcohol, of course, the act of taking this may be consciousness and knowledge, hence a different matter altogether. These are all said to be incapable of acting knowingly and with sufficient knowledge. So again, so those children who are below the age of reason, or those people who are insane, senile, lunatics, or under the heavy influence of drugs and alcohol, all right, are said to be incapable of acting knowingly and with sufficient knowledge. So they actually don't belong to this element. So the act must be deliberate. So it must be conscious and in our awareness. Number two is the act must be performed in freedom. So it must be done by an agent who is acting freely with his or her own volition and powers. An action performed under duress and against one's own free will cannot be strictly considered a free and voluntary action. So it should be from your personal free will. It should be performed under certain distress or against your will. The person who is performing the action should be free from any force beyond his or her control or from any powerful influence from the outside. Otherwise, we can say that the act is not truly and entirely his or her own. Number three, the act must be done voluntarily. Okay, it must be performed by an agent who decides willfully to perform the act. The act to be truly to be truly voluntarily one must come from the core of a person's being. It should come from you, intrinsic, innate from you. This willfulness is the resolve to do an act here and now, in some other time in the future. Okay, so it should be from your voluntarily self. It should be not it should not be forced by other persons or by other organizations. So ayun, so those are the three elements of the human acts. Summing up these three elements, human acts are actions done with knowledge, freedom, and with consent or voluntariness. Thus, as the human act is done knowingly, freely, and voluntarily, the person concerned becomes morally accountable of such an act. The absence or lack of any of these essential elements render an entire act defective and less voluntary, which in turn also affects its moral quality. Alright, again, the absence or lack of any of these essential elements, it will render an act or the human act to be defective, okay, which will affect the moral quality. Let's go to the major determinants of the morality of human acts. So, by determinants of morality, we mean the various factors or elements that would allow us to identify concretely whether a certain and a particular act done in a given situation is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral, in reference to the objective norm of morality. So, more specifically, determinants of morality refer to the sources that define the goodness, rightness, or badness, wrongness of actions done with knowledge, freedom, and consent. Okay, so we have some major determinants here are as follows. Number one, the act itself or the object of the act. So the act itself or the object of the act refers to the action that is done or performed by an agent or simply what the person does. This is the substance of the moral act and here regarded as the basic factor of morality. It is the act which the will chooses to perform or which it deliberately wills, object of the will act. It is the act that really terminates the activity of the will and that gives direction to any motion. The consent of the will derives its morality first and foremost from the act, so that the will consents to. Okay, so from the standpoint of its object, morality can be objective and intrinsic. This means that objectively there are actions by themselves taking as mere acts, as good and bad, right and wrong. moral or immoral. So by their very nature, murder, rape, torture, cheating, blasphemy, adultery, and the like are really morally wrong or bad. Thus, no amount of good intention or favorable circumstance can alter their evilness. Their badness is something embedded in the very nature. Okay, I hope that is clear. Number two is the motive or the intention. So, the motive is the purpose or intention that for the sake of which something is done, it is the reason behind our acting. It answers the question why the person does what he does. One normally performs an act as a means to achieve an end or goal different from the act itself. And since the motive or intention is practically present in all human acts, it then becomes an important and integral part of morality. Okay, so depending on one's motive or intention, a particular act or conduct can be modified in its moral worth. Thus, under the motive or intention, there are four principles. All right, first is an indifferent act can become morally good or morally evil depending upon the intention of the person doing the act. Number two, an objectively good act becomes morally evil due to a wrong or bad motive. Number three, an intrinsically or objectively morally good act can receive added goodness if done with an equally noble intention or motive. Number four, an intrinsically evil act can never become morally good even if it is done with a good motive or intention. Example of here is cheating in an exam to pass the subject. Number three major determinant is the circumstances. Let me further explain this. So the moral goodness or badness of an act is determined not only by the object or act itself, plus the motive or intention of the moral agent, but also the circumstances or situation surrounding the performance of the actions. So we can say that circumstances refer to the various conditions outside of the act. They are not strictly speaking part and parcel of the act itself. Circumstances are conditions that influence to a lesser or greater degree the moral quality of the human act. So they either affect the act by increasing or lessening its voluntariness or freedom, and thus affecting morality of the act. Okay, again, the circumstances, they refer to the various conditions which the action is not involved. They are not strictly speaking part of the act itself. So these are such conditions that could really affect the act by either increasing or lessening the willingness of the person or his or her freedom to do such act. Thus it really affects the morality or the quality of the morality of the act. Okay, I hope those are clear, and that's the end of our discussion. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.